The wind was a bitter blade, scouring the last remnants of warmth from the high plains as Alara watched the sun bleed across the horizon. It painted the world in brutal shades of orange and bruised purple, mirroring the ache in her own chest. Dust, fine and unforgiving, coated everything: the weathered planks of the porch, the skeletal branches of the lone cottonwood, the very air she breathed. It had been 3 months since the fever had taken Thomas, 3 months since the silence in the small farmhouse had become a constant, suffocating presence, louder than any storm. Now another kind of storm was gathering, one with a name: Baron Ashworth. His land swallowed up the surrounding ranches and farms like a hungry beast, and her small plot, nestled between his vast holdings, was the last morsel he coveted. A formal notice, cold and curt, sat on the rough-hewn table inside, stating that the outstanding loan, hastily taken by Thomas for seed just before he fell ill, was now due. The amount was impossible. Baron Ashworth knew it was impossible. His steward, a man with eyes like chips of flint, had delivered the notice with a smirk that promised ruin. Alara clutched the worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. The course was little defense against the gnawing chill that wasn't just from the wind. It was the chill of absolute aloneness, of being vulnerable and exposed in a world that had suddenly turned its harshest face towards her. The land stretched out, vast and indifferent, under the dying light. It was beautiful in a cruel, wild way, the only home she had ever known with Thomas. Losing it felt like losing him all over again, a final, irreversible severing of the life they had built together, sod by painstaking sod. Fear, cold and sharp, was a constant companion now, a knot in her stomach that tightened with every creak of the house, every distant sound carried on the wind. She was just one woman, alone against a power that seemed as insurmountable as the mountains on the distant horizon. The thought of packing the few possessions that remained hers, of leaving the gravesite on the hill, of abandoning the fields they had tilled with their own hands, was a pain almost physical in its intensity. She had no family nearby, no one to turn to. The few neighbors who hadn't already been bought out or driven off by the Baron kept their distance, wary of attracting his attention. She was an island, shrinking with each passing day, the predatory tide of the Baron's ambition rising around her. The air grew colder, the stars beginning to prick through the fading light, vast and uncaring. She stayed there, a small, determined figure against the immensity of the landscape, until the last vestige of color leached from the sky, leaving only the stark, cold blackness and the howling wind. Inside, the house was dark and silent, a perfect reflection of the emptiness that echoed within her. The notice waited on the table, a stark white threat in the gloom. The deadline was a week away, a week to find the impossible or lose everything. Despair was a heavy cloak, threatening to smother the last embers of her will. But beneath the fear, a stubborn ember flickered. Thomas had loved this land. He had worked himself to the bone for it. She couldn't simply surrender it to a man who cared only for its value, not its soul. But what could she do? She was trapped, cornered, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The wind howled louder, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to voice her own silent cry of anguish. She was a widow alone, facing the wolves, and the pack leader was already at her door. The steward had returned 2 days later, not to discuss terms, but to survey the property with insolent precision. Alara had watched him from the porch, her hands clasped tightly, trying to project a strength she didn't feel. He was thin and sharp-featured, his gaze missing nothing, cataloging the sturdy construction of the barn, the promising breadth of the fields, the valuable water rights from the stream that bordered the property. He had pointed here and there, jotting notes on a pad, his movements dismissive, as if she weren't even there, as if the farm was already a done deal, merely a piece of property to be assessed and absorbed. It was humiliating, infuriating. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that this land was more than just acreage and assets, that it held the weight of years, of dreams, of sweat and blood and love. But she remained silent, her jaw set, knowing that any show of emotion would only be seen as weakness. He finished his inspection and walked back towards his buggy, the Baron's crest emblazoned on its side. a constant reminder of the power arrayed against her. Just before stepping up, he paused, turning those flinty eyes on her. "The Baron is a busy man, Mrs. Jensen. He doesn't tolerate delays or sentimentality." His voice was low, a silken threat. "It would be wise to prepare yourself. This land will belong to the Ashworth estate by week's end." He didn't wait for a response, climbing into the buggy and clicking the reins. As it pulled away, raising a cloud of dust, Alara felt a cold dread wash over her. Prepare herself. For what? For being homeless? For watching strangers take everything she and Thomas had built? The physical act of leaving seemed insurmountable. Every object in the house, every nail driven into the walls, every stone cleared from the fields, held a memory. How could she just walk away from the echo of Thomas's laughter in the kitchen? The feel of his hand in hers as they walked the rows of young corn, the quiet strength of his presence. It wasn't just land they wanted. It was her past, her present, her future. The steward's words echoed the brutal reality. Sentimentality had no place in the Baron's world. Only acquisition. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, moving through the familiar rooms like a ghost, touching the worn surfaces, the chipped teacups, the books on the shelf that Thomas had loved. Each touch was a small ache. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, a fitting soundtrack to her despair. Later that afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching from the direction of the Ashworth Manor. Alara's heart leaped into her throat, expecting the steward's return, or worse, the Baron himself. But as the rider drew closer, she saw it wasn't the steward. It was a younger man, tall and lean, sitting easily in the saddle. As he neared the house, she recognized him, Elias Ashworth, the Baron's son. He rarely came this way, usually preferring the company of the town or riding the vast northern pastures of his father's land. He pulled his horse to a stop a short distance from the porch, dismounting with a fluid grace. He wasn't dressed in the Baron's usual formal attire, but in practical riding clothes, dust coating his boots and trousers. He stood for a moment just looking at the house, at the fields, at her. His expression was unreadable, a quiet intensity in his eyes. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting, just watched. Alara remained on the porch, wary, unsure of his purpose. Was he here to deliver another message? To gloat? He was the Baron's son, after all, presumably cut from the same cloth. Yet, there was something different about him, a stillness that contrasted with his father's blustering greed. He didn't have the steward's sharp, cruel eyes. His were a deep, thoughtful gray, and they seemed to take in the scene with a quiet contemplation, not predatory assessment. He took a step closer, then another, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the gravel path. Alara held her breath, her hand instinctively reaching for the worn wooden railing of the porch, the solid feel of it a small comfort. What did he want? He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, still not speaking. Alara could see him more clearly now. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with a face that was more serious than handsome, etched with a quiet reserve. His gaze lingered on the fields, then swept over the house, before finally settling on her face. There was no sign of the steward's smugness or his father's arrogant impatience. Only that same quiet intensity. He seemed uncomfortable, not with her presence, but with the situation itself. It was a strange observation, and she immediately dismissed it. He was an Ashworth. They were all the same. "Mrs. Jensen," he finally said, his voice low, a surprising gentleness beneath the formal address. It wasn't the loud, booming voice of his father, nor the sharp, clipped tone of the steward. It was measured, quiet. I saw the steward here earlier. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact." Alara nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. He shifted his weight, glancing back towards the direction of the manor. "My father mentioned." The lone, another pause. The wind whipped a strand of hair across Alara's face, and she tucked it back, her movements stiff. "He said you had received notice." "Yes," Alara managed, her voice thin. He knows I cannot pay. He expects the land, Elias said, stating the obvious truth with a simple, direct honesty that somehow cut deeper than the steward's veiled threats. It was stripped of pretense. Alara looked away, towards the mountains, her eyes blurring slightly. It's all I have left. He was silent for a long moment, the wind the only sound between them. When he spoke again, his voice was even lower. I disagree with my father's methods, Mrs. Jensen. The confession hung in the air, unexpected and startling. Alara's head snapped back towards him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. But his expression remained earnest, that same quiet reserve tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Regret? Disapproval? He is relentless when he wants something, Elias continued, almost to himself. Especially land. He sees it only as wealth, not a home. He looked back at the house, then at the fields, a flicker of something akin to understanding in his gray eyes. Alara didn't know how to respond. Was this a genuine sentiment, or some elaborate game? And Ashworth disagreeing with his father was like the sun rising in the west. Unthinkable. Why are you telling me this? She asked, suspicion lacing her voice. He met her gaze directly then, and for the first time, she saw a depth there that surprised her. Because I wanted you to know, he said, his voice barely audible above the wind, that not all of us approve. He took a step back, towards his horse. I should go. He didn't offer help, didn't suggest a solution, just offered that single, unexpected admission of dissent. He mounted his horse, the movement economical and practiced. He looked down at her one last time, a long, searching look that held a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps just a shared weariness with the world his father inhabited. Then he turned the horse and rode away, back towards the sprawling manor, leaving Alara standing alone on the porch once more, the wind biting at her skin, her mind reeling from the brief, strange encounter. And Ashworth, disagreeing with his father. It changed nothing about her immediate predicament, but it introduced a sliver of complexity into the black and white world of her fear. Elias Ashworth's unexpected visit and his quiet admission of dissent lingered in Alara's mind like a persistent, unresolved chord. She replayed his words, his expression, searching for a hidden motive, a trap, but she found none. Only that genuine seeming discomfort and the quiet declaration that he did not approve of his father's ruthlessness. It was a small thing, a mere ripple in the ocean of her problems, yet it offered a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks, curiosity, and perhaps a minuscule, fragile tendril of hope. The days crawled by, each one bringing her closer to the deadline. She tried to think, to plan, but her mind felt paralyzed by fear and despair. She walked the fields, touching the dry earth, whispering to the ghosts of her dreams. She sat by Thomas's grave, telling him about the Baron, about the threat, about the strange visit from his son. The silence offered no counsel. One afternoon, as she was trying to mend a section of fence that had come loose in the wind, Elias rode past again. He was further out this time, riding along the fence line that marked the border between her land and his father's estate. He slowed as he neared her, pulling his horse to a walk. Alara straightened, her hands still holding the fence wire, her gaze wary. He stopped opposite her on the other side of the low wire. "Mrs. Jensen," he said again, the same quiet tone. Alara nodded, waiting. He dismounted, looped the reins around a fence post, and stepped over the wire, approaching her slowly. He stopped a few feet away, his hands resting lightly on his belt. He didn't invade her space, didn't loom over her. He simply stood there, a presence that was both watchful and strangely non-threatening. "Still struggling with that old fence?" he asked, his gaze on the sagging wire. "It needs more than struggling," Alara replied, her voice still guarded. "It needs proper tools, and more strength than I have right now." He looked at her then, a direct, assessing gaze that wasn't cold, but seemed to take in her weariness, the smudges of dirt on her face, the quiet determination in her eyes. "My father's fences are always in good repair," he said, a hint of something unreadable in his voice. Alara didn't respond. Of course they were. He had the men and the resources. He believes property lines should be indisputable, Elias added, almost musing, especially when they are soon to shift. The implied threat, though delivered quietly, was stark. Alara felt her jaw tighten. They haven't shifted yet, he nodded slowly. No, not yet. He looked back at the fence wire in her hands. That post looks rotten at the base. Alara followed his gaze. He was right. Even if she could fix the wire, the anchor was giving way. Yes, she admitted, her voice flat. Everything needs repair these days. He knelt down then, without a word, examining the base of the post. His movements were practiced, knowledgeable. He wasn't afraid of the dirt. It was a test, she realized. A test of her trust and perhaps a test of his sincerity. The wind stirred the dust around them, the only witness to this strange, tentative exchange between the widow fighting for her home and the son of the man trying to take it. Alara stared at him, the hammer heavy in her hand. The proposal wasn't spoken, but it hung between them, a quiet offer of temporary, practical aid from the most unlikely source. Felt profoundly disorienting. Accepting his help felt like a betrayal of her own resistance, like acknowledging a dependence on the very family that sought to ruin her. Yet, the simple, undeniable truth was that the fence needed fixing, and she couldn't do it alone. The broken wire was a small thing, but in her current state, it felt like another symbol of her unraveling world. She looked from the rotten post to Elias's face, searching again for the hidden agenda. But his expression remained open, devoid of calculation. It was just a quiet offer of competence. Why? She asked, the single word cutting through the silence. He didn't look away. It needs doing, he said simply, as if that were explanation enough. And you are struggling, not pity, not condescension, just observation. It disarmed her slightly. He wasn't offering charity. He was acknowledging a task that needed doing and her current inability to complete it alone. My father wouldn't approve, Alara pointed out, testing him. A flicker of something crossed his face, perhaps resignation or weariness. My father rarely approves of anything I do, he replied, his voice low, a hint of wryness in his tone. It was another small crack in the formidable image of the Ashworth family, revealing a layer of complexity, maybe even rebellion, she hadn't expected. The wind moaned around them, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant pine. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The moment felt poised, fragile. Alara made a decision, a small leap of faith born of desperation and that sliver of curiosity. I don't have the materials, she said, not quite accepting but not refusing either. He nodded, understanding. I can bring some. Tomorrow. Before noon. It was a statement, not a question, implying a quiet certainty that he would come. Alara hesitated for only a moment longer. All right, she said softly, the word feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. Tomorrow. A ghost of a smile touched Elias's lips, the first she had seen. It didn't transform his serious face, but it softened his eyes. Until tomorrow then, Mrs. Jensen. He stepped back over the wire, mounted his horse, and with a single nod rode off, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Alara watched him go, a swirl of conflicting emotions churning within her. Relief that the fence might be fixed, apprehension about what this small act of connection might mean, confusion about Elias Ashworth himself. He was an enigma, a quiet presence that didn't fit the narrative she had constructed about his family. The wind seemed less hostile now, or perhaps she was simply too preoccupied to notice its bite. She walked back towards the house, the notice still on the table, the deadline still looming. Fixing the fence wouldn't pay the debt, wouldn't save the farm, but it felt like something. A small act of defiance against the forces of decay and despair. And it involved the son of her enemy, offering a helping hand across the contested border. It was a strange, fragile beginning to something she couldn't yet define. Trust was a plant that grew slowly, especially in this harsh soil, under this unforgiving sky. But for the first time in a long time, a tiny seed had been planted. True to his word, Elias Ashworth arrived the next morning just as the sun cleared the peaks. He rode a workhorse this time, a sturdy, broad-chested animal, and behind it, he led a pack mule laden with supplies. New posts, rolls of wire, tools she recognized but didn't possess: a fence stretcher, post-hole diggers, heavy-duty pliers. He dismounted near the fence, his movements quiet and efficient. "Morning, Mrs. Jensen," he said, his tone the same quiet, formal one as before. Alara stood on the porch, watching him unload the materials. It felt surreal, seeing the Baron's son performing manual labor on her land, bringing the very things his father's power would ultimately deny her. "Mr. Ashworth," she replied, unsure how else to address him. He glanced up, a faint smile touching his lips. "Elias is fine. Given we'll be sharing the fence line for a while. The phrase hung heavy between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the looming deadline. It underscored the temporary nature of this truce, this strange alliance. He didn't dwell on it, however, immediately setting to work. He moved with an economy of effort, knowledgeable and strong. He showed Alara how to use the post-hole digger, his hands guiding hers for a moment on the heavy tool, his touch impersonal but steady. They worked in silence mostly, the only sounds the grunt of effort, the scrape of tools against earth, the whine of the fence stretcher pulling the wire taut. Alara found herself watching him, observing the set of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the surprising calluses on his hands. He wasn't the idle, spoiled son she might have imagined. He worked with a quiet dedication, focused on the task at hand. He didn't talk about his father, didn't ask about her situation, didn't offer platitudes. He simply worked. And as they worked side by side, a different kind of communication began to unfold. Small gestures of him handing her a tool before she asked, her holding a post steady as he tamped earth around it, a shared glance of satisfaction when a section of wire was finally taut and secure. The silence wasn't awkward. It was companionable, a shared space of effort and purpose. Alara felt some of the tension she had been carrying begin to ease. Working with her hands, with the earth, felt grounding. And having another person beside her, even this unexpected one, chipped away at the edges of her crushing loneliness. When they broke for a moment, sitting on the newly installed fence, the sun high overhead, Elias produced 2 apples from his saddlebag. He offered one to her. "From our orchard," he said. Alara accepted it, surprised by the simple, shared gesture. They ate in silence, the crisp sweetness a welcome contrast to the dust and the dryness in her mouth. "You're good at this," Alara said finally, gesturing to the repaired fence section. He shrugged slightly. "I prefer being out here, working with my hands. My father. He prefers the ledger books." The contrast was clear, spoken without bitterness, just a simple statement of differing natures. "It's hard work," Alara said. "Alone?" he nodded, looking out over her fields. "I imagine it is. Your husband, Thomas, he built all this." Alara felt a familiar pang of grief, but nodded. "Every bit of it. He loved this place. It shows," Elias said quietly, his gaze lingering on the land. "There's a life to it. Not just lines on a map." His words, so different from the steward's cold assessment, resonated deeply within her. He saw the life, the history, the love embedded in the soil. It was more than she had allowed herself to hope for from an Ashworth. As the day wore on, they finished the fence repair, the new wood and wire standing strong and true against the wind. It was a small victory, perhaps, but a tangible one. When the work was done, Elias packed his tools back onto the mule. "Thank you," Alara said, genuinely grateful. He met her eyes, his expression soft. "You're welcome, Mrs. Jensen." He paused, then added, "The deadline. It's still approaching." The harsh reality returned, snapping the fragile thread of camaraderie. "I know," Alara said, her voice low. He seemed to hesitate, as if wanting to say more, but ultimately he just nodded, a look of troubled resolve on his face. "Keep the tools for now," he said, Just in case, just in case. The words hung in the air, a vague, uncertain promise. He mounted his horse. I hope things find a way to work out, Mrs. Jensen. It wasn't the confident assurance of someone with power, but the quiet wish of someone who felt powerless to change the larger tide. He rode away, leaving Alara standing by the newly mended fence, the borrowed tools at her feet, the impossible deadline still ticking down. The days that followed Elias's help were a strange mix of renewed determination and heightened anxiety. The repaired fence was a small symbol of resistance, but it did nothing to alleviate the Baron's claim. Alara tried to think of alternatives, reaching out to old acquaintances in town, desperately seeking someone who might lend her the impossible some needed. But doors remained closed. No one wanted to cross Baron Ashworth. His shadow was long and cold. She saw Elias riding on the periphery of her land sometimes, a silent, watchful presence. He didn't approach, didn't offer more help, but his presence was a quiet acknowledgement, a reminder that she wasn't entirely unseen in her struggle. It was a small comfort, almost too fragile to grasp. The steward returned 2 days before the deadline. This time, he was accompanied by 2 burly men whose expressions were as hard and unyielding as stone. They didn't dismount, sitting on their horses and observing with chilling indifference. The steward remained in his buggy, but his voice carried the weight of his master's authority. Mrs. Jensen, he called out, his tone sharp. The deadline is upon us. The Baron expects his payment. Or his property. Alara walked to the edge of the porch, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood straighter than she felt, meeting his gaze with a defiance she hoped masked her terror. I don't have the money, she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. The steward smirked, a cruel twist of his thin lips. A pity. The Baron is not known for his patience. He gestured to the 2 men beside him. These gentlemen will remain on the property until the matter is resolved. Discouragement against any foolish notions of flight or obstruction, Alara's blood ran cold. They were here to intimidate her, to ensure she didn't disappear or try anything desperate. They were like vultures waiting. You can't just trespass, she protested, her voice rising. This is my home. Not for long, the steward sneered. The Baron holds the paper. The law is on his side. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I suggest you start gathering your personal effects, Mrs. Jensen. The transfer of ownership will proceed as planned with that. He turned his buggy and drove away, leaving the 2 silent, menacing figures on horseback stationed near the edge of her property. Alara watched them go, her hands clenched into fists, nails biting into her palms. Despair washed over her, stronger than ever. They were here. The end was truly near. She felt a surge of hot, useless anger, followed by a wave of crushing helplessness. What could she do? 2 men. She was alone. The house felt less like a sanctuary now, more like a cage. She retreated inside, the presence of the men outside a heavy weight pressing down on her. She didn't eat, didn't light a lamp as dusk fell. She sat in the gathering gloom, listening to the wind, and imagining the 2 men outside, their silent watch a constant reminder of her impending fate. Just before complete darkness settled, she saw another rider approaching from the direction of the manor. It was Elias. He rode directly towards the 2 men, stopping short of them. Alara watched from the window, her breath catching in her throat. What was happening? She couldn't hear their words, but she saw Elias speaking to the men, his posture stiff. The men shifted in their saddles, glancing towards her house. One of them gestured dismissively. Elias didn't back down. He continued speaking, his voice low but firm. Even from this distance she could sense his resolve. There was a tension in the group, a standoff. Finally, Elias turned his horse and rode towards the house, leaving the 2 men where they were, their silent watch unbroken. He dismounted by the porch, his face grim in the fading light. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the 2 figures across the field. Elias climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wood. He stopped a few feet from where Alara stood, her face pale in the dim light. They're staying, he said, his voice tight with frustration. My father's orders. To ensure compliance, Alara nodded, unable to speak. Their presence felt suffocating. Elias ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign of agitation. I argued with them, told them they weren't needed, that you wouldn't cause trouble. He let out a short, sharp breath. They said their orders came directly from my father. To wait until tomorrow. When the lawyer arrives tomorrow. The word hung in the air, heavy with finality. Alara felt a prickle of tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Not in front of an Ashworth. Even this one. Elias, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you here? He looked at her then, his gray eyes troubled. I told you, I don't agree with this. With the way he acquires things, he gestured vaguely towards his father's distant manor. He sees land as wealth, as power. Not lives. Not people's homes, he paused. Then his voice lowered. He didn't tell me he was sending men tonight. There was a vulnerability in his admission. A sense of being excluded or perhaps overruled by his father's methods. It seemed his dissent wasn't just a quiet opinion. It was a genuine rift. What can you do? Alara asked, the question born of desperate hope more than realistic expectation. He was the Baron's son, yes, but clearly the Baron held the reins of power firmly. Elias looked towards the two figures on horseback, then back at Alara, his expression hardening with resolve. I can't stop him legally. Not directly. Not yet, he paused, his gaze scanning the property, the house, the barn. But I can make it. Difficult for him. How? Alara prompted, leaning forward slightly, a flicker of something awakening within her. He intends to take possession tomorrow, cleanly and quickly. With witnesses, Elias explained, his voice low and urgent now. He wants you gone, with no fuss, no resistance. Just vacated property. He met her eyes. What if you weren't gone? Alara stared at him, confused. They're outside. I can't leave. I can't fight them. I don't mean leaving, Elias said. I mean, being here, making a fuss, making it difficult for him to simply walk in and take over. Refuse to sign. Refuse to leave. Make him force you out. In front of witnesses, Alara's mind reeled. Defiance? Against the Baron? The idea was terrifying, yet it resonated with a deep, buried part of her. The part that refused to surrender Thomas's memory, their life together, to a man who saw it only as a transaction. He would just force me, she said, still hesitant. He'd have the sheriff. Or those men, yes, Elias admitted. But it wouldn't be clean. It would be messy. It would draw attention. My father values his reputation, the appearance of legitimacy. Forcing a widow off her land, physically dragging her out. That's not the image he cultivates. And the witnesses? Alara asked. Who would witness it? The lawyer, Elias said. And I'll be here. Alara looked at him, startled. You? Your father's son. Precisely, Elias said, a grim determination in his voice. If his own son is here, if his own son is uncomfortable with his actions, complicates things. It makes him look less like a legitimate businessman and more like a bully. Even to his own people, it was a risky plan, a terrifying plan. It involved confronting the Baron directly, refusing to yield, and relying on the hope that Elias's presence and the potential for public spectacle would give the Baron pause. But what other choice did she have? Surrender quietly and lose everything anyway? At least this offered a chance, however slim, to fight back, to make it costly for the Baron, even if she ultimately failed. She looked towards the dark shapes of the men outside, then at the house, her home. A surge of fierce, protective emotion rose within her. I won't leave, she said, her voice stronger now. I won't make it easy for him. Elias met her gaze, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Good, he said. Tomorrow then. Stand your ground, Mrs. Jensen. I'll be here. The decision was made. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now laced with a fierce, protective resolve. She wouldn't go quietly. She would fight, with the only weapon she had left. Her refusal to yield, her presence on the land that was rightfully hers. And she would have an unlikely ally in the son of her enemy. The morning of the deadline arrived, gray and cold. Alara had barely slept, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. She dressed in her plainest, sturdiest clothes, feeling as though she were preparing for battle. The two men were still outside, silent and watchful. Just after the sun had fully risen, she saw the dust cloud on the road, the Baron's carriage, approaching. Her heart hammered in her chest, a drumbeat of pure terror. But beneath the terror, a strange, hard calm had settled over her. She would not yield. She would stand her ground, as Elias had advised. The carriage pulled up, stopping near the house. The steward was there, of course, along with a portly man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase, the lawyer. And then, Baron Ashworth himself emerged. He was a large man, imposing and dressed in fine, dark clothes that seemed out of place on the dusty prairie. His face was florid, his expression one of impatient authority. He looked around, assessing ownership already in his eyes. Alara remained on the porch, her arms crossed, a small, defiant figure. The Baron saw her and his already impatient expression soured. "Mrs. Jensen," he boomed, his voice loud and accustomed to being obeyed. "The hour is here. Have you the funds?" Alara met his gaze directly.
No, Baron.
"As you well know, I do not." The Baron's face darkened. "Then you understand the terms. The property is forfeit." "The property is my home," Alara stated clearly, her voice surprisingly steady. "It belonged to my husband, and his father before him. It is not forfeit." The Baron took a step towards the porch, his face twisting in annoyance. "The paper says otherwise. You defaulted on the loan. The law is clear." "The law may be clear," a voice said from beside the carriage, calm but firm. It was Elias. He stood there, not beside his father, but slightly apart, his hands clasped behind his back. The Baron spun towards him, surprised. "Elias, what are you doing here?" "I told you to remain at the manor." "I felt it necessary to attend, father," Elias replied, his gaze steady. "To ensure everything was handled properly." The Baron bristled. "Properly? Of course it will be handled properly. This is a simple matter of foreclosure." He turned back to Alara, his voice regaining its blustering volume. "Mrs. Jensen, I will not tolerate further delay. My lawyer is here. You will sign the transfer papers, or my men will escort you from the premises." He gestured towards the two men on horseback, who remained silent, menacing. The lawyer stepped forward, holding out a document. "If you would just sign here, Mrs. Jensen, we can conclude this matter swiftly and without unpleasantness." Alara didn't move. She looked at the lawyer, at the steward, at the two guards, and finally at the Baron. Then she looked at Elias, who met her gaze, offering a silent, steady support. Taking a deep breath, Alara spoke, her voice clear and carrying across the dusty yard. "I will not sign." The Baron's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "You refuse." "I refuse to give you my home," Alara said. "You seek to profit from my husband's death and my hardship. This is not justice. It is greed." The Baron roared, taking another step towards the porch. "Greed? It is business. The loan is overdue. You have no right to refuse." "She has every right to refuse to abandon her home, father," Elias interjected, stepping forward slightly. "Especially when the terms of the loan were onerous from the start. Designed, perhaps, to ensure this outcome." The Baron rounded on his son, his eyes blazing. "Elias, silence yourself. Do you know what you are saying?" "I know exactly what I am saying," Elias replied, his voice gaining strength. "This is not merely a business transaction. It is an eviction of a widow from her home, and I, for one, do not approve." The air crackled with tension. The Baron stared at his son, momentarily stunned into silence by the public defiance. The steward looked nervous, the lawyer uncomfortable. The two guards remained impassive, waiting for orders. Alara stood on the porch, watching the confrontation unfold, a sense of disbelief warring with a surge of unexpected strength. Elias's intervention had changed everything. It wasn't just her alone against the Baron anymore. The conflict had been brought into the heart of the Ashworth family itself. You dare to question me? Here? Now? The Baron sputtered, his voice shaking with rage. Before these witnesses? Yes, father, Elias said, his voice calm but resolute. Because this is wrong. You are taking advantage of Mrs. Jensen's vulnerability. It is unjust. Unjust? The Baron bellowed, finding his voice again. It is the law. She owes the debt. A debt you made sure she could not pay. Elias countered, his gaze unwavering. The interest rate was exorbitant. The timing of the demand, immediately after Thomas Jensen's death, was predatory. The lawyer cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Ashworth, perhaps we could discuss this privately? There is nothing to discuss privately, Elias said, not taking his eyes off his father. My father intends to evict this woman from her rightful home for a debt she cannot meet due to circumstances beyond her control, on terms that were designed for her failure. I will not stand by and watch it happen. The Baron advanced on Elias, his face contorted with fury. You will return to the carriage, Elias, and hold your tongue, or you will regret it. I will not regret standing against injustice, father, Elias said, standing his ground. But perhaps you will regret the spectacle you are creating. Forcing a widow out with your son publicly opposing you. It does not look good. Not for a man who cultivates an image of respectability and adherence to the law. He gestured towards the road, where a couple of passing riders had slowed, curious about the commotion. Word travels fast, father. How will it look in the town? In the papers? Baron Ashworth, hounding a grieving widow off her land while his own son condemns his actions. The Baron glanced instinctively towards the passing riders, then back at his son, his bluster momentarily faltering. Elias had struck a nerve. The Baron valued his standing in the community, the veneer of legitimate power. This public display of familial conflict and questionable ethics was damaging to that image. He glared at Elias, then back at Alara, who stood tall on the porch, her fear now replaced by a fierce, protective energy. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The steward looked increasingly uneasy. The two guards remained still, but their attention was now fixed on the dramatic scene unfolding between father and son. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The Baron was cornered, not by Alara's physical resistance, but by the social and familial pressure Elias had expertly applied. He couldn't simply order his men to drag Alara out with his son standing there, drawing attention and condemnation. It would confirm everything Elias was saying. He visibly struggled with his rage and his need to maintain appearances. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats and challenges. Finally, the Baron let out a frustrated growl. This is not over, Mrs. Jensen. He spat, his eyes narrowing. He turned to the steward. Pack up. We're leaving. The steward looked surprised but quickly scrambled to comply. The lawyer, looking relieved, gathered his papers. Elias, the Baron said, his voice low and venomous. We will discuss this later. Yes, father, Elias replied, his expression unyielding. The Baron climbed back into his carriage, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. The steward joined him. The lawyer followed. The carriage turned and pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust and a stunned silence in its wake. The two guards hesitated, looking from Elias to Alara. Elias nodded towards the road. You may return to the manor. They looked at each other, then slowly turned their horses and rode off after the carriage. Alara remained on the porch, watching them disappear. It was over, for now. She looked at Elias, who stood watching the dust settle, his posture still tense. He had done it. He had faced his father publicly and defended her. The relief that washed over her was so profound it almost buckled her knees. She had not lost. Not today. Alara sank onto the top step of the porch, her legs trembling. Elias turned and walked towards her, his own tension seemingly dissipating as the Baron's presence receded. He didn't sit beside her, but stood a few feet away, looking out at the quiet fields, the newly mended fence. "Are you all right, Mrs. Jensen?" he asked, his voice soft, the quiet formality back, but now tinged with something new, a shared experience, a quiet understanding. Yes," Elara breathed, wrapping her arms around herself. "I think so. I can't believe he values his reputation," Elias finished for her. "More than he values fairness." Sometimes he paused, choosing his words carefully. "It wasn't just about you. It was about standing for something." Even against him, Elara looked at him, seeing him not just as the Baron's son, but as Elias, a man who had made a difficult choice, who had risked his father's wrath to do what he believed was right. "You risked a great deal," she said. He shrugged slightly, though the gravity of the moment was clear in his eyes. "Perhaps, but I couldn't let him do it. Not like that." He looked at the land again. "This place, it has a soul." He just seized the price. Elara felt a warmth spread through her chest, replacing the cold fear. He truly saw it. He saw the life, the history, the love that was woven into the fabric of this place. "He will be angry," Elara said, thinking of the Baron's furious face. "Very angry," Elias confirmed, a grim certainty in his tone. "This changes things. Between us, between father and son. It was a rift that might not heal." Elara felt a pang of sympathy for him, despite everything. He had sacrificed something significant for her. "What will you do now?" she asked. Elias was silent for a long moment, looking out at the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted, the quiet honesty striking. "But I won't apologize for this. And I won't change my mind about this." He gestured to the farm. "He still holds the paper, Mrs. Jensen. He could still try again. Find another way." The threat hadn't vanished entirely, only been postponed and complicated. "I know," Elara said, the brief respite of relief giving way to the understanding that the fight wasn't over. But now she wasn't facing it alone. Elias turned to her, his gray eyes steady. "But he knows now. He knows you won't yield easily. And he knows I won't support him in this." It was a fragile shield, perhaps, but a shield nonetheless. Elara looked around her, at the farmhouse, at the fields, at the distant mountains. This land, this home was worth fighting for. And Elias Ashworth, the most unexpected ally, had given her a chance to continue that fight. "Thank you, Elias," she said, the formal address gone, replaced by a simple, heartfelt gratitude. He offered a small, genuine smile. "You are a resilient woman, Mrs. Jensen. More resilient than he gave you credit for." Resilience. The word settled within her, solid and true. She had been tested, brought to the brink of despair, but she had not broken. And in the face of overwhelming power and cruelty, she had found an unexpected ally, a quiet strength emerging from the very family that sought to destroy her. The future was still uncertain. The Baron's anger was a storm yet to break. But she was no longer just a vulnerable widow facing down a greedy Baron. She was Elara Jensen, standing on her land, beside the son who chose justice over blood, ready to face whatever came next. The wind still blew, but it felt less like a blade and more like a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, life persisted, and sometimes unexpected alliances could bloom in the dust. The fragile peace held for a few days. The Baron made no immediate move, perhaps nursing his wounded pride or rethinking his strategy. But the tension remained, a low hum beneath the surface of life on the farm. Elara knew this was merely a pause, not a resolution. Elias visited again, not formally this time, but riding over in the late afternoon. He brought with him a sack of flour and some sugar, practical gifts, offered with quiet respect. Elara accepted them, the simple exchange solidifying the unspoken bond that had formed between them. They talked, sitting on the porch as the sun began to set, not about the Baron or the looming threat, but about the land, about farming, about the quiet rhythm of the seasons. Elara found it surprisingly easy to talk to him, sharing stories of Thomas, of building the farm piece by piece, of the hopes they had held for the future. Elias listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, his presence a quiet comfort. He spoke briefly about his own life at the manor, a world of strict expectations and formal obligations that felt stifling, a stark contrast to the open sky and honest work of the farm. He didn't complain, simply stated it as fact, shedding more light on the reasons behind his defiance. He felt more at home here, in the dust and the quiet, than in the gilded cage of his father's world. One evening, as they watched the stars begin to appear, Alara asked him directly, "What will happen now, Elias?" "With your father." Elias was silent for a moment, gazing out at the vast, star-filled sky. "I don't know," he said again, the uncertainty still there, but now overlaid with a quiet determination. "He hasn't spoken to me since. Not directly about that day." He paused. "He expects loyalty, obedience." This was a profound break. "Are you afraid?" Alara asked softly. He met her gaze, and in the dim light, she saw the truth in his eyes. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "My father is a powerful man. His anger can be cold, but he didn't look away, didn't flinch. His fear was not paralyzing. It was simply a truth he acknowledged and moved past. But," he added, his voice firmer, "I'm not going to back down." Not on this. Alara felt a wave of admiration for him. He was facing down a power far greater than hers, the power of expectation, of family obligation, of his father's absolute authority. And he was doing it for a stranger, for a principle. As the days passed, the Baron's silence grew heavier. It wasn't a sign of surrender, but rather the coiled tension before a strike. Elias continued to visit, his presence a quiet anchor in the uncertainty. They worked together on small tasks around the farm, mending another section of fence, clearing brush, preparing a small vegetable patch near the house. These shared tasks weren't about survival in the immediate sense, but about tending to the land, a quiet act of reclaiming and holding on to what was theirs. The Baron's steward appeared again, this time without the guards. He rode up to the porch, his face impassive. "Mrs. Jensen," he said, "the Baron wishes to see you. At the manor. Tomorrow morning." It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Alara's stomach clenched. This was it. The next move. Was it a trap? A new threat? Or had Elias's actions truly forced his father to consider a different approach? She looked at Elias, who had appeared at her side as the steward delivered the message. His face was set, his jaw tight. "I will come with you," he said immediately, his voice leaving no room for argument. The steward's eyes flickered to Elias, a hint of surprise there. "The Baron requested only Mrs. Jensen," he said, a slight edge returning to his voice. "I understand," Elias replied coolly, "but I will accompany her nonetheless, to ensure." "The discussion is fair." The steward hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle the Baron's defiant son. After a moment he gave a curt nod. "As you wish, Mr. Ashworth." Tomorrow morning he turned and rode away, leaving Alara and Elias alone once more, the summons hanging in the air. "It could be a trap," Alara voiced, the apprehension clear in her tone. "He could try to intimidate you without witnesses." Elias met her gaze, his eyes calm despite the tension. "Then we face it together," he said simply. The "we" felt significant. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs. The manor was grand and imposing, a stark contrast to the humble farmhouse. It felt cold and unwelcoming, despite the servants who moved silently through the halls. Alara walked beside Elias, her spine straight, trying not to let the opulent surroundings or the implied power intimidate her. Elias seemed unfazed, moving with a quiet confidence that suggested he was navigating familiar, if uncomfortable, territory. They were shown into the Baron's study, a large room filled with dark wood, leather, and shelves of books Alara knew he likely never read. Baron Ashworth sat behind a massive desk, looking every bit the powerful man he was. The steward was present, standing stiffly near the fireplace. There was no lawyer this time, no guards. Just the Baron, his steward, Alara, and Elias. The Baron's expression was unreadable, a mask of controlled anger and something else Alara couldn't quite decipher. "Mrs. Jensen," the Baron said, his voice low and devoid of its usual bluster. It was more chilling in its quiet intensity. "Thank you for coming." Alara didn't reply, simply nodded and stood her ground. "I understand you believe you were treated unfairly," the Baron continued, his gaze flicking to Elias for a brief, charged moment. "And that you are attached to this land." He said the word attached, as if it were a peculiar affliction. "It is my home, Baron," Alara stated firmly. The Baron leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Foreclosure is a legal process, Mrs. Jensen. The debt is valid. Your husband signed the agreement under duress, during a desperate time." Elias interjected quietly from beside Alara. The Baron's eyes narrowed, but he didn't lash out as he had before. He merely held Elias's gaze for a moment before returning his attention to Alara. "Regardless," the Baron said, his voice regaining a hint of its former hardness, "the law is the law. I could proceed tomorrow and have you legally removed." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Alara met his gaze steadily. "You could, but it would cost you, not just financially, your reputation, the goodwill you claim to value." She spoke with a quiet dignity, drawing strength from Elias's presence beside her and her own resolve. The Baron studied her, his expression shifting slightly. He saw not just a grieving widow, but a determined woman who would not be easily broken or silenced. He glanced at Elias again, a silent acknowledgement of the rift his son had created. He was calculating, weighing the cost of pursuing the foreclosure against the damage it would do to his standing. He had been thwarted by something he hadn't anticipated: unexpected resistance and betrayal from within his own house. "Very well," the Baron said, the words clearly difficult for him to utter. "Perhaps there is another solution, a compromise." Alara remained silent, wary but listening. "The debt stands," the Baron said, "but perhaps we can arrange a payment plan." Alara's eyes widened slightly. A payment plan? It was more than she had dared to hope for. "The amount is still impossible for me to pay quickly," she said, her voice cautious. "I understand," the Baron conceded, his gaze fixed on her, assessing. "We can discuss terms. A longer period. Reduced interest." He made it sound like a generous offer, but Alara knew it was a concession forced by Elias's intervention and her own refusal to back down. "In return," the Baron added, his voice hardening slightly, "you will cease any public complaints regarding my business practices, and young Elias here will reconsider his public statements about my methods." He looked directly at Elias, a clear demand in his eyes. Elias met his father's gaze, his expression unreadable. This was the Baron's leverage, his way of regaining control and silencing the dissent. Elias was being asked to compromise his principles for Alara's sake, to potentially mend the rift with his father at the cost of his integrity. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken challenges and expectations. Alara looked from the Baron to Elias, her heart pounding. The decision rested with Elias now. His choice would determine not only her future but the path of his own life, the nature of his relationship with his powerful father. The silence stretched, heavy and significant. Elias met his father's gaze, the weight of the Baron's demand pressing down on him. It was a clear ultimatum. His loyalty, his silence, in exchange for a chance for Alara to keep her farm. It was a bitter pill, a test of his convictions. He glanced at Alara, who watched him with quiet apprehension, her fate intertwined with his decision. He had spoken out because he believed it was wrong. To retract that now, to go back on his word, felt like a profound betrayal of himself and of the fragile trust that had grown between him and Alara. But if he refused, his father's offer might be rescinded, and Alara would be back to facing eviction, perhaps with the Baron even more determined and ruthless now that his authority had been publicly challenged. It was a terrible choice. He knew his father. The offer of a payment plan, however seemingly generous, was conditional. It was designed not just to recoup the debt, but to reassert control, to silence the dissenting voice of his son. To accept fully would be to admit he was wrong, to speak out, to fall back into the expected role of the obedient heir. But denying it could lead to Alara's ruin. Elias took a breath, the air in the study thick with the Baron's unspoken power. He looked back at his father, his expression one of quiet resolution. "I cannot retract my statements, father," he said, his voice low but firm. "I meant what I said. I believe your methods in this instance were unjust." The Baron's face darkened instantly, a flash of dangerous anger in his eyes. The steward shifted uncomfortably. "Elias," the Baron snapped. "You fool. You would jeopardize this offer for pride. For principle," Elias corrected calmly. "I cannot pretend to agree with something I believe is wrong." He turned slightly towards Alara. "Mrs. Jensen deserves a chance to save her home, father. But not at the cost of truth. Or of silence." The Baron glared at him, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his desk. He had miscalculated. He thought the threat to Alara's farm would force Elias's compliance. Instead, Elias was holding firm, refusing to compromise his integrity, even when it was the apparent price for helping Alara. The standoff continued, the Baron's fury palpable, Elias's resolve unyielding. Alara watched them, her heart aching for the young man who was sacrificing his standing with his father for her. It was a profound act of courage. Finally, the Baron let out a long, slow breath, a sound of grudging defeat. He looked from Elias to Alara, his face a mask of frustration. He had been outmaneuvered, cornered by his son's unexpected principles and Alara's quiet resilience. He still held the power, the legal claim, but he could see the cost of enforcing it now. The public spectacle, the familial rift, the potential for further resistance. It was messy, undignified, and damaging to his carefully constructed image. "Very well," the Baron said, his voice clipped and cold. "The payment plan stands, Mrs. Jensen, regardless of my son's continued foolishness." He shot a look at Elias that promised future consequences. "But understand this. You will meet every payment on time to the letter. If you miss one, even by a day, the original terms apply. And I will take the land." It was a harsh condition, a tightrope walk for Alara, but it was a chance. A chance to work, to save, to keep her home. Alara felt a wave of relief so strong it made her lightheaded. "I understand, Baron," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I will meet the payments." The Baron nodded curtly, already dismissing her. "The steward will draw up the revised agreement. You will sign it before you leave." He then turned his full, icy attention onto Elias. "As for you, son, we are far from finished." Alara knew their battle was just beginning, a different kind of fight within the walls of the manor. But for her, the immediate threat had receded. She had her home and a chance to save it. As the steward prepared the papers, Alara looked at Elias. He met her gaze, and a faint, tired smile touched his lips. He had paid a price, but he had stood firm. And in doing so, he had not only helped save her farm but had forged his own path, separate from his father's legacy of greed. The future was uncertain for both of them, but they had faced down a powerful force and emerged, bruised but not broken, ready to face the challenges ahead, perhaps, together. The revised agreement was strict, the payments daunting, but it was a path forward where none had existed before. Alara signed the papers, her hands steady, the act feeling not like capitulation, but like a declaration of war waged with persistence and hard work. Leaving the manor, walking back out into the bright, clean air of the prairie felt like escaping a cage. Elias walked with her to her waiting buggy, the silence between them different now, not just wary or companionable, but heavy with the unspoken consequences of his actions. "He will not forgive this easily," Alara said softly, as they reached the buggy. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where his father's manor was visible, a distant, imposing shape. "I know," he paused, then turned to face her. "But I don't regret it." Alara, the use of her first name was a quiet intimacy, acknowledging the barrier they had crossed. "Neither do I, Elias," she replied, meeting his gaze. He had stood for her, against his own blood, against the very foundation of his expected life. It was an act of profound courage that resonated deeply within her. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently clasping her shoulder. It was a brief, platonic touch, but it conveyed a depth of connection forged in shared adversity. "Work hard, Alara," he said, his voice earnest. "Save your home." "I will," she promised, her voice fierce with determination. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "And, if you need help," with anything, he didn't need to elaborate. She knew what he meant, not just with fences, but perhaps with navigating the Baron's continued machinations, or simply with the weight of loneliness. "Thank you, Elias," she said again, the words insufficient to convey her gratitude. He dropped his hand from her shoulder. I should go. His path lay back towards the manor, towards the inevitable confrontation with his father. Hers lay back towards the farm, towards the daunting task of meeting those payments and rebuilding her life. Their worlds were different, yet they were now undeniably linked. Alara climbed into her buggy, the borrowed strength from Elias's presence a quiet force within her. As she turned the buggy towards home, she saw Elias still standing there, watching her go, a solitary figure against the vast landscape. She drove away, the dust rising behind her, leaving the Baron's manor behind. The farm came into view, small and humble, but her own. The fields stretched out, awaiting her touch. The house stood waiting, a silent promise of shelter and memory. The path ahead was challenging, marked by hard work and the constant threat of the Baron's displeasure. But Alara was no longer the same woman who had watched the sunset in despair weeks ago. She had faced her deepest fears, found resilience she didn't know she possessed, and discovered an unexpected ally in the most unlikely place. She was a widow, yes, and her farm was still in peril. But she was also a woman who had stood her ground, who had been fought for, and who was ready to fight for herself, with newfound strength and a quiet, hopeful resolve. The journey ahead was long, but she would face it, step by painstaking step, tending to the land, honoring Thomas's memory, and building a future on the solid, unforgiving earth she called home.